Hello, everyone. My name is Juliana Bidadanure, and I'm the faculty director of the Stanford Basic Income Lab. And I'm an assistant professor in political philosophy here at Stanford. So first, let me say thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited about this event. And I want to start by asking you a couple of questions just to get a sense of who is in the room. So can you raise your hand if you've come to one of our other events on basic income last year? Okay, so quite a few people who have been. And then how many of you have read about basic income in the past year in the press? Okay, good. So as you will have seen, basic income is becoming more and more popular and more discussed and debated in the media. And as many of you may have noticed, it's often introduced through the lens of automation, right? So robots are coming, they are coming for our jobs, this will cause technological unemployment, and so we have to come up with a way to give everyone an income without having to rely on those jobs. So one of the goals of the Stanford Basic Income Lab, which is a research center that was established in February last year, is to kind of broaden the horizon and reopen the debate on the broader conceptions that underpin the policy. So the policy has been discussed and defended and opposed from within a variety of different political perspectives. And so we are trying to explore all of those perspectives and to see what the debates were in each of those. So most of you will know about basic income. I'm just going to start with a very brief definition, just so we are all on the same page. Basic income is an unconditional, universal, and individual cash payment. It's the basic idea that everyone deserves to be given cash, often on a monthly basis, but it has to be frequent. It could be on a yearly basis. And it's individual, which means that every individual gets it, even if they depend on a rich enough spouse. It's unconditional, so it's no strings attached. You get it regardless of the choices you make, whether you decide to work and how you decide to work. And it's universal, which means it's not means-tested, it's not targeted, so everyone gets it. So we've organized a couple of events so far on basic income, and the videos are online. So if you want to learn about this, feel free to go on the website of the Center for Ethics in Society. One of those two events in particular was on experiments. So we learned from experiments in Kenya, in India, and from the new experiment in Auckland by Y Combinator Research. And our next event on basic income will be taking the perspective of racial justice. That's going to be in January. We are going to hear from Dorian Warren and Mia Birdsong. Dorian is going to introduce us to the reasons why the Black Panther Party and Martin Luther King have advanced the idea of a guaranteed income. What were their reasons, and what maybe were some of the debates at the time. Today, we are going to focus on the feminist debate on universal basic income. And so the big question here is, to make it simple, should feminists endorse basic income? At least that was the way it was framed a few years ago. There was a special issue with that particular topic that came out in basic income studies. And that's always been a really fascinating debate to me. So on the one hand, you would think that unconditional cash can contribute to the empowerment of women in various ways, because you remember it's individual. So that means that even if you're married to someone who earns enough to support a family, or was considered to earn enough to support a spouse, you still get a basic income. So it reduces the economic dependency of women on their husbands. And so that's very important, since we know that abuse in relationships is often very linked to economic dependency. And basic income is unconditional, so it contributes to the remuneration of care work. And so, since a lot of the care work is being done by women, it's often seen, and often without compensation, universal basic income is seen as a way to actually get us closer to the goal of gender justice. But, and this is where there is a debate, Some worry that it could help further entrench gender norms, encouraging women to withdraw from the labor market. Right? So which is it? Can universal basic income be a tool of women empowerment, or is it not a good tool of gender equality? Or maybe both, right? So in which case, what should we think overall? So this has been a debate for a while. And to answer those questions, we have the best speaker we could have imagined on this topic, Almaz Zelleke. Almaz is an associate professor of practice of political science at NYU Shanghai. Almaz's research is in political theory and public policy in general, and in particular in feminist theory. She is on the International Advisory Board of the Basic Income Earth Network, which is a network of academics working on universal basic income, and on the board of advisors of the US Basic Income Guarantee Network. She's one of the world experts on the topic of today, so I'm very looking forward to know what she thinks about all those questions. So that's it for the introduction. I'm just gonna leave the floor to our speaker, but before I do that, I have two quick things I want to say. So one is exciting and the other one is boring, but nonetheless important. So I'm gonna start with the boring one. So at the end of this event, there is a math exam scheduled. So we need to finish on time. And we are going to ask you to leave the room quickly at the end and through the side doors, please. And that's to enable the exam to start and proceed smoothly. The other announcement, for those in the room that maybe are not convinced that universal basic income is much more than an academic conversation, is that today, and I'm sure few of you will know because it was announced a few hours ago, the mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, who is an alumni of Stanford, has announced a basic income pilot in the city of Stockton. So they have dedicated $1 million with the help of the Economic Security Project to give unconditional cash to a selected number of residents for several years. And they therefore join the existing experiments that are underway in Ontario, Canada, in Finland, in Kenya, and close to here in Auckland, where the Y Combinator research pilot is based. Okay, that's all for me, and I'll invite Almaz to join us. So please join me in thanking her for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Juliana, for that kind introduction. I am delighted to be here at the Basic Income Lab and at Stanford University and to have a chance to talk with all of you about basic income and gender. And I should just say that I'm not going to answer Juliana's question directly. I'm going to, I hope, give you in this talk the basic background information as I see it that's necessary for each of you to make up your own minds about whether feminists and whether people who are interested in gender egalitarianism should endorse a basic income. And I think my own view will be pretty clear after the talk. So as Juliana noted, I'm trained as a political philosopher, and I'm interested in the applications of theory to contemporary issues of public policy, particularly issues around equality and inequality, gender, and the welfare state. As a graduate student, I was broadly interested in the topic of economic justice, but I was not sure how to channel that interest into a dissertation of reasonable size and scope until one of my advisors directed me to political philosopher Philippe von Parijs, who I know has been a previous speaker here, to an article that he wrote in 1991 that was titled "Why Surfers Should Be Fed." It's about basic income, and I knew after reading that article that I'd found my topic. I was immediately intrigued by the idea of a basic income, but I didn't know if it could be justified according to any of the theoretical paradigms that was available to me at the time. It was pretty clear that it wasn't justifiable within mainstream liberal egalitarian theory of that era, which was dominated at the time by John Rawls's theory of justice, with Rawls in particular famously asserting that those who choose to surf all day off Malibu must find their own way of supporting themselves. They should not be entitled to redistribution socially. My exploration of possible justifications for basic income led me to feminist political theory, and in particular to feminist critiques of liberalism by theorists like Susan Muller-Oken, Carol Pateman, Nancy Fraser, and many others. I came to see, or at least to argue, that basic income needs feminist theory in order to overcome liberal egalitarian objections to its fundamental principles of unconditionality and universality. So when I was asked by Juliana to talk about what basic income would do for gender, I told her that I had to address as well what a gender perspective does for basic income. So arguments for basic income continue to be my main academic interest, and I work to bring theories of distributive justice and feminist theory in conversation with policy discussions related to the welfare state, taxation, labor market policies, and so on. So in this talk, I'll move back and forth between theory and policy, as both perspectives are required to fully understand the implications and the radical potential of a basic income, not only for gender justice, but for justice in general. So I'll begin with presenting my understanding of a basic income and then discuss its normative justifications in the US context and the common objections to a basic income, and then explain how a gender perspective is required to overcome these objections, and particularly, as I said, the objection to unconditionality. I'll end by discussing the effects of a basic income on gender equality, political as well as economic equality. Okay, so first, what is a basic income? As Juliana said, it's primarily indicated by three principles, but the contemporary basic income movement is a big tent, and particularly as we're seeing with all of the pilots that are being proposed, it encompasses a wide range of implementation policies, and I think that, as I said, the theory is important, but the policy details are also important in terms of what the emancipatory effects of a basic income are. So we'll start with the general principles, and then I'll say a little bit about the actual details of implementation. So basic income is, as Juliana said, unconditional, it's universal, and it's individual. Those are very important, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a moment. Because of these three core principles, basic income is both a radical emancipatory route to a more just and egalitarian society, and at the same time, a surprisingly efficient means to achieve a range of more incremental goals on the social policy agenda. In Van Parijs's words, basic income is the marriage of justice and efficiency. And I'll move back and forth between these two aspects of basic income in my talk, its normative and efficiency aspects. Now, I want to say a little bit about why basic income has found itself on the agenda in the US and around the world at this particular moment. The idea, in its contemporary form, has been around for decades. In its earliest formations, it's been around since at least the Enlightenment. So why did it emerge when it did? Why was it mostly ignored during the great period of welfare state formation in the mid-20th century? And why is it ubiquitous now? Well, basic income is only relevant to societies that meet two conditions. First, they must be broadly committed to the ideal of equality, but fall short of that ideal in the distribution of or access to resources. Basic income doesn't make sense in aristocracies, oligarchies, kleptocracies, but neither does it make sense in robustly egalitarian societies, where natural and personal resources and talents are broadly and equitably shared. So basic income is particularly of interest in democratic capitalist societies that suffer from a mismatch between their egalitarian politics and their inegalitarian economics, in the form of either poverty or inequality, or sometimes both. After a period of declining inequality in the Western world in the mid-20th century, as a result of the destruction of capital in the two world wars and the growing economies that followed the Second World War, inequality is now on the rise, even in the strongly egalitarian social democracies of Northern Europe. In the United States, of course, we suffer from both poverty and inequality. Our poverty takes the form both of absolute and relative poverty. A significant proportion of the population living without what we ourselves define as the resources necessary for life, and a significant proportion living in households that earn less than half of the median income. Those are the two definitions of absolute and relative poverty. We are the country with either the largest or the second largest economy in the world, but our close competitor in my academic home, China, has 1 billion more people than we do. So on a per capita basis, we're considerably richer. We're not the richest country in the world. We're only somewhere in the top 10 richest, depending on who's counting. But we are, with a per capita income of about $58,000 a year, the richest large economy. And large here means with a population of more than 10 million people. Despite our riches, we have a significant proportion of our population living in poverty. In the US, the official figures are that 13%, or 1 in 7 of us, live in absolute poverty as we define it. If we look specifically at families with children, with minor children, we see that 18% of families, 1 in every 5 or 6 families, lives in absolute poverty. But because these calculations are made on an annual basis, they miss the fluctuations of income that mean that those just above the poverty threshold at the end of the year may have spent several months intermittently below the poverty threshold over the course of the year. So if we instead look at those with income that is less than 125% of the official poverty threshold, the absolute poverty rate rises to 17%, and the rate for families with minor children rises to 24%. So almost 1 in 4 families with minor children lives below or just above the poverty threshold in one of the richest countries in the world. So what are these poverty thresholds? It's $12,000 for an individual, $16,000 a year for 2 people, and about $24,000 a year for a family of 4. So to address poverty in the United States, basic income has to be designed with these poverty thresholds in mind. This implies a minimum basic income of $500 a month or $6,000 a year for every adult and child in the United States. Now, note that this differs from the way basic income is often discussed, as you may have seen in some of the press reports about it, as a $1,000 monthly benefit that goes to adults only, or with larger amounts for adults and smaller amounts for children. Because poverty in the United States disproportionately affects women and children, it is more efficient in terms of cost and more effective in terms of poverty alleviation to provide a smaller, uniform benefit, at least $500 a month, that goes to adults and children. I'll get back to that a little bit later. Now, to address inequality in the United States, the basic income would have to be significantly higher, and it would have to be financed progressively. I'm not going to spend too much time on inequality for the moment, except to say that along with our high per capita income, we have one of the highest rates of income inequality on a household basis in the developed world. Consistently in the top 5, regardless of the measure of inequality used among advanced industrialized countries, whether we're talking about the Gini coefficient, the 80-20 ratio, or the share of GDP increases that go to different deciles of the population. On any measure, we are one of the most unequal societies. And a lot of the focus since Thomas Piketty's data was published in 2014 in his book, Capital in the 21st Century, has focused on the fact that, or on the amount of wealth controlled by the richest 1% in our society. I find the fact that the bottom 50% in the United States own less than 1% of our national wealth. Less than 1%. I find that to be the truly astonishing figure that comes out of that data. So the figure I gave, I want to be clear, $500 a month for every adult and child in the United States is truly a minimum if we want to address inequality. But even with that modest amount, even if that modest amount is provided unconditionally, it would be a revolutionary change in the lives of our most vulnerable citizens. Okay, so let's move on to answering the next question. How do we justify a basic income, and what does gender have to do with it? Let's start by taking a moment to consider why our existing welfare state does such a poor job of addressing poverty, let alone income and wealth inequality. Why don't our existing income support benefits eliminate poverty? We have in the United States, and in most developed countries, 2 forms of income support: social insurance and social assistance. Social insurance includes programs in the US like Social Security and unemployment insurance, which require prior contributions to establish eligibility, and in which benefits are scaled to income, to earned income. Social assistance programs include supplemental security income for seniors who don't qualify for adequate Social Security benefits, temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, for the working aged who don't qualify for unemployment insurance, and the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, commonly known as food stamps. There are others, but these are the big 3. In contrast to basic income, as I described it, social insurance and social assistance programs are conditional rather than unconditional. They are targeted to particular groups, either through means testing or contribution testing, rather than universal. Significantly, Social Security benefits are individually based and sometimes additive. In the case of Social Security, for example, family members can receive their own benefits on top of the primary beneficiary's benefit. On the other hand, social assistance benefits are household-based and non-additive. Individual benefits can actually be reduced if formerly separate beneficiaries join households, form joint households that lead to higher combined income or assets than they had on their own. So social insurance benefits complement work, while social assistance benefits are typically structured as alternatives to work and are lost once paid earnings reach a level that, in the United States at least, is well below the poverty threshold. This dual system of income support is, it should be stressed, not intended to eliminate poverty. Rather, its intention is to support and reinforce the system of waged labor associated with industrial capitalism, and so it's ill-equipped to help those at the margins of the labor market. At its best, it's based on a mythical ideal of a full employment, non-discriminatory labor market with only temporary or intermittent disruptions to income flows, and in which income correlates with factors within our individual control: skills, education, training, effort, in sum, desert. It's also premised on traditional family structures that are not only outdated, but that obscure the economic inequalities and vulnerabilities within families. Models of family structure which assume stable two-parent families, a division of labor between productive paid employment and unpaid reproductive labor, and an equitable share of resources within the family. We can see this best actually in the idiosyncratic structure of Social Security, which provides individual benefits to dependents, spouses and minor children of retirees, not on the basis of their own need or on contributory taxes, but on the basis of their relationship with the primary beneficiary. Social assistance programs, on the other hand, are meant to provide income support for those who fall outside the mainstream norm of the worker-centric social insurance system: widows, orphans, disabled, and seniors with little or no eligible work history. Pitied, in historian Linda Gordon's words, but not entitled by virtue of any sanctioned or meritorious relationship. So is it possible to reform these programs to do better at alleviating poverty? This, in my view, is the doomed strategy of much of the left in the United States today, whose proposals for expanding social assistance programs or re-energizing the union movement or implementing a guaranteed jobs program all fail to confront the inherent incompatibility of categorical benefit programs that distinguish among different groups of needy with the goal of economic security in a capitalist economy. Even with an explicit commitment to poverty elimination, these programs would be unable to do so because of their conditionality, their targeting, and their family and household basis of calculating benefits. Why is this the case? Let's look at each of these design features in turn. And let's start with conditionality. Even the best designed conditional programs, like Social Security, for example, will always leave some uncovered because they're designed to exclude those who don't meet their conditions. Those, say, who don't want to work because they prefer to surf all day off Malibu. But others will be excluded from conditional or contributory benefits because of involuntary or underemployment, the scarcity of available and affordable care options that make work possible, or illness or disability that is intermittent and fails to qualify for disability benefits. Second, because these programs are targeted, they cannot simultaneously eliminate poverty and keep program costs low. Targeting benefits to the poor requires high benefit withdrawal rates, effectively high tax rates and benefit cliffs. These are not design flaws, they are inherent in means testing. Benefits are often withdrawn at effective 30% tax rates on incomes below the poverty threshold. This is in comparison to a maximum income tax rate of 40% for millionaires. This is true of the earned income tax credit, for example. The the benefits of the earned income tax credit, which is often touted as one of the most successful programs at alleviating poverty for low-wage workers, those benefits start to tail off before you reach the poverty threshold for the family size. Sometimes benefits also are lost completely if income rises above a modest level. So contribution testing, as is required for unemployment insurance or Social Security benefits, often excludes those unable to work even if willing, or those whose work is informal, highly intermittent, or deliberately under the table to avoid earning out of means-tested programs like Medicaid and housing support. So Medicaid coverage, for example, is an example of a kind of a benefit cliff, where if you either get it, if your income is below a certain amount, if your income rises above that, you lose it completely. So in the case of social assistance programs, the complexity and ambiguity of means tests, along with the stigmatization of programs targeted to the poor, lead to severe under-enrollment of those in need, as is the case with temporary assistance to needy families, which is estimated to reach fewer than 1 in 4 poor families. This problem is compounded when social assistance is divided among many different programs with different eligibility requirements and means tests, and harsh penalties for violating program conditions. Third, because needs assessments are household or family-based, recipients actually lose benefits when they take steps that could improve their economic situations, like marrying or combining into joint households. As, for example, when an elderly supplemental security income recipient moves in with her adult child, and then the child's income goes towards her means tests, or 2 low-wage workers receiving the earned income tax credit get married. In both cases, benefits will be reduced, if not eliminated entirely. So again, I want to stress that these are not the result of poor program design. They are inherent in the design of conditional, targeted, and household or family-based benefits. They are rather the result of a society that prioritizes the norms and needs of the market sphere and ignores the market's dependence on the reproductive work of the family sphere, on a view that takes the life patterns of independent adult men as the model of citizenship, ignoring the life patterns of women and the mutual dependence that permeates all our lives at every stage of life. This dual social insurance, social assistance model is based on what many feminist political theorists have pointed out is an androcentric or male-centric industrial capitalist model citizen, an autonomous, independent, and dependent free male whose workplace is separate from his home and who, when he is not engaged in work, is engaged in leisure, and who has achieved his status as a market agent on the basis of voluntary, unpaid non-market labor, generally performed by women, that is of secondary concern in terms of public policy. To the extent that this model has been expanded to include working women, it remains grounded in what Nancy Fraser, political theorist Nancy Fraser, calls the universal breadwinner model of citizenship, which assumes that women can take on the life patterns of men and that care can be commodified in a way that liberates both men and women to work in the empowering sphere of paid employment and leave behind the marginalizing sphere of care and family. Under this model, those who choose not to work must naturally reciprocate for any income support provided by submitting to a range of conditions set by those who control society's resources. All right, so let's take a look at how basic income avoids the design problems of our conditional, targeted, and family and household-based benefits, and what each of its core principles, universality, unconditionality, and individuality, says about the model of citizenship on which it is based. So let's start with universality and individuality, and we'll leave the most counterintuitive and most controversial feature, unconditionality, for last. Now, in discussing basic income's universality, I want to first clear up 2 common misconceptions about what it means, as the term is easily misconstrued. First, universality does not necessarily imply an expansive notion of membership beyond citizenship or national borders. It can, but it doesn't have to. What it means, instead, is the opposite of targeting benefits through ex-ante means testing and condition testing to specific populations within a political community. That is, it's not limited to those who prove themselves to be the deserving poor before they receive it. This, in turn, does not mean that basic income involves sending checks to billionaires. If, as it should be, basic income is funded by progressive taxation, billionaires will be net payers, not net beneficiaries, of the basic income system. But the sorting into net beneficiaries and net payers happens after benefits are received and taxes are calculated, not before benefits are paid out. This has little effect on the billionaires who would be wasting their time registering for the basic income only to repay it at the end of the year with their taxes, but they would not be penalized for doing so. But it has an enormous effect on the economic security of those whose incomes fluctuate throughout the year, and who currently have to calculate their eligibility for income support programs with significant uncertainty, and to document their adherence to conditional requirements on a regular basis. Universality is both a normative principle, a recognition of the right of all people in a rich country to the resources necessary for life, but it's also one of efficiency and effectiveness, because it's much likelier to both reach all that need it and to be recouped through taxes from those who don't, an effect termed targeting through universalism. So next, let's look at basic income's individuality. Individuality means treating all recipients as individual benefit claimants and tax units. Why is this important? Well, I've already alluded to the fact that the desire to limit the cost of social assistance programs and target them to the poor means that recipients are perversely disincentivized to marry or to set up joint households or to move in with family members who are able to provide financial help and perhaps care of children or elders. But even in two adult families, non-additive benefits discourage the work of secondary or lower paid workers in particular. So think of a two-adult family where one adult serves as the primary earner and the other serves as the primary caregiver, and at the same time is a potential secondary earner. Because of the benefit phase-outs and benefit cliffs inherent in targeted programs, secondary earnings are disincentivized if they are not high enough to replace the lost benefits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or Medicaid, that go to low-wage workers. While disincentivizing secondary earners' labor force participation may incentivize useful investments in care in two-parent families, we know that dropping out of the labor force has lifelong negative consequences for working life income and income in retirement of secondary workers, who are disproportionately women. This problem is similar to the marriage penalty inherent in joint taxation of couples. The marginal tax rates applied to the high earner's income also apply to the first dollar of income earned by the lower earner, reducing the rewards to work and increasing incentives for assigning the lower earner, again disproportionately the woman, to unpaid care work. So individualizing basic income means that each adult's benefit is independent of their partner's benefit and provides an independent income for secondary earners or unpaid caregivers. A basic income that goes to children as well as adults multiplies this effect, giving even greater economic voice and standing to caregivers, as well as committing funds explicitly designated for investments in the development of children, which we know pay off in terms of better educational earnings and health outcomes throughout the life when applied early in life. Individuality takes the principle of universality a step further in recognizing the right of every individual, regardless of relationship status, to an individual right to the resources necessary for life. Now, on to unconditionality, the most controversial and counterintuitive principle of the basic income. Americans broadly support the provision of social assistance for those who are temporarily or intermittently unable to meet their basic needs through their own means, as well as social insurance to ensure the economic status of those who work in paid employment. But unconditionality means that individuals are eligible to receive a basic income without working, without demonstrating their willingness to work, through evidence of a job search, without any documentation of care work or participation in other activities deemed worthy by society. On the efficiency front, it should be clear that unconditionality increases take-up of benefits by those who need them, as it eliminates both the stigma of benefits targeted to the poor and the uncertainties and obstacles around determining eligibility. But unconditionality seems to offend our intuition that those we support with our hard-earned dollars should do their fair share, or to reciprocate for income support. How can we avoid supporting free riders, those Malibu surfers, if income support is unconditional? So this is where I think the gender perspective rescues unconditionality from the reciprocity objection, as it's described in the literature, also known as the exploitation objection, which refers to the exploitation of crazies, those who work hard and pay taxes, by lazies, those who claim benefits without working. Recall that this opposition of crazies and lazies imagines a society in which human activity is divided into work and leisure, with no formal recognition of the activity of care, which falls into neither category. The fear of free riding is based on a view of society that not only prioritizes the norms and values of the market over those of the family, but ignores completely the social obligations we incur as beneficiaries of unpaid care work. As such, it is based at best on a principle of selective reciprocity for the social benefits produced by the market, but ignores the need for reciprocity for the social benefits produced by the family. The idea of a basic income, in contrast, is based on a principle of universal reciprocity, recognizing the interdependencies we all share, not only when young or old, but throughout our working lives, and recognizing that human activity includes, and social institutions must support, work, leisure, and care, for all and by all. Nancy Fraser calls this the universal caregiver model of citizenship, and this model requires that the principle of reciprocity must extend beyond reciprocity for income support to include reciprocity for care work. In short, basic income recognizes both the dependence of the market on the family to reproduce and care for productive workers, and the dependence of the family on the market to provide resources to meet its needs. In place of providing selective benefits and imposing selective reciprocity, the universal caregiver model provides universal benefits and universal reciprocity through a basic income. On a normative level, all three of basic income's core principles undo the subservience of the family or the reproductive sphere to the market or the productive sphere of paid employment. Instead, the norms of the reproductive sphere are seen as having equal standing with and even priority over the norms of the productive sphere. Unconditional basic income, together with a sphere of market employment, balances our need for both unconditional care and incentives for productive activity beyond that care. A system of conditional benefits, like the one we have now, prioritizes the values of the market over the family. Conditionality first, through submission to the norms of the market, and then unconditionality, while a system of unconditional benefits prioritizes the values of the family over the market. Unconditionality first, through adherence to norms of the unconditional care of the family, then conditionality through participation in the market sphere. Adopting the perspective of two co-equal spheres with a prioritization of the sphere that must come first, as years of care are required before productive citizens can take their place in the market, is, I argue, the only way to decisively rebut the normative objections to unconditionality. So note crucially that basic income supports unpaid care, but it does so without creating incentives for one spouse or one gender to devote themselves to care to the exclusion of work and paid employment. Because of its universality, individuality, and unconditionality, basic income creates a foundation on which everyone can combine care and paid employment, either simultaneously or at different life stages, without subjecting caregivers to the lasting negative effects of giving up income while caring. It incentivizes the economies of scale of joint householding without requiring anyone to take up the status of dependent in the process, and it multiplies the benefits available to those who need care through income support of both the cared and the carer. Now, notice that this argument makes no claim that all will engage in either or both care and paid employment. It doesn't claim to eliminate the possibility of free-riding Malibu surfers. What it does is prioritize the economic security of the vast majority who do and will continue to engage in care and paid employment, rather than the punishment of those who choose to live on their basic income alone. All right, but another objection that is raised to basic income is its sustainability, right? It could be the case that, in fact, there's some value to this idea of recognizing care work and compensating for it in a certain way. But would the basic income be sustainable? What if, in the end, it changes people's behavior so that the incentives that we currently have for people to engage in paid employment diminish or go away altogether? So here we moved from the justice of a basic income and its efficiency compared to existing income support programs to its sustainability. If basic income is unconditional, why would anyone work and pay the taxes that are necessary to finance it? Why wouldn't such a big change the incentives currently in place? Again, the gender perspective challenges the fear that most people would not work, because it draws attention to the enormous amount of unpaid work that caregivers already perform. We know that work in paid employment requires a supportive infrastructure, strong and dynamic labor markets, education and skills training, access to transportation, and affordable and reliable child and elder care. We know these requirements present obstacles to labor force participation, and the economic security of a basic income can help overcome each of these obstacles. With all the interest in piloting basic income that is now going on, it's useful to remember that we already have evidence from pilot programs in the United States in the 1960s and 70s that demonstrated that basic income-like supplements did not significantly reduce the work hours of primary earners. Secondary and tertiary earners, generally at the time wives and high school students, did reduce their working hours, with the data suggesting that they devoted more time to care and education. We should also remember that currently, even senior citizens work, and they are eligible for comparatively generous Social Security benefits. Almost 1/3 of 65 to 69-year-olds participate in the labor force, despite having average Social Security benefits more generous than a $6,000 or even a $12,000 a year basic income. So although it may be counterintuitive to think that a basic income would incentivize work, it shouldn't surprise us if we compare basic income to means-tested benefits. And this is where program design is as important as the idea in the abstract. Compared to means-tested benefits, as long as the basic income is progressively taxed, it's financed through progressive taxation, and it itself is progressively taxed, rather than structured as a negative income tax with steep phase-out rates, a basic income better preserves incentives to work, since recipients keep their basic income as they begin to earn income from paid employment. This is the design superiority of universality over means testing. At the low end of the income scale, we should expect high marginal tax rates, which is what steep benefit phase-outs effectively are, to have stronger disincentive effects than high marginal tax rates at the higher end of the income scale, where income is more likely to come bundled in jobs that have more intrinsic value, have greater future earnings potential, and have supplementary benefits that promote labor force attachment. Still, it is likely that some would decide to retreat from the labor force, live off their basic incomes, and not contribute through productive work. Is this a bug or a feature? Some labor force withdrawal could leave the jobs to those who really want them, and potentially, if enough workers withdraw from the labor market, put upward pressure on wages for those workers who remain, which would in turn draw some back into the market as wages rise. If we believe in the market, and we better believe in the market given how much it controls our lives, why would we believe that the market would not reach an equilibrium point on labor supply just because no one was forced any longer to work out of fear of absolute desperation? You have to believe that large numbers of people would be so work-averse that they would not want to undertake any paid employment to improve their financial situations above the modest level of the basic income. If this is the case, it draws welcome attention to problems that we need to fix that have nothing to do with basic income. But again, from a gender perspective, it's simply implausible when you consider how long and hard women and other excluded populations have fought for access to the labor market, for the earned income for sure, but also for the other rewards of participation in the labor market that a basic income does nothing to undermine. There's still hard work to be done to build the political case for a basic income, particularly around the redistribution of income and wealth it would require, but we should not fear a crippling decline in labor force participation. When faced with these concerns, we should always remember to compare basic income to its feasible alternatives. And when we do, we see that at least the modest basic income that is currently plausible, in my opinion, in the United States, will have positive, not negative effects on labor force participation, as compared with our current system of conditional, targeted, and family and household income supports. I hope by now it's clear that the argument for a basic income is, at its core, an argument for valuing the foundational contributions of the family sphere, that the family sphere and the labor of women in particular contributes to society. I hope I've made clear that basic income has the potential to eliminate absolute poverty once and for all in the United States by prioritizing the norms and values of the family sphere over those of the market sphere. I hope I've shown that the strongest objections to a basic income have reasonable and persuasive responses. And to wrap this up, let me just reiterate the ways in which a basic income would serve as the foundation for a more equitable society for all, women, men, and children. Absolute poverty disproportionately affects women of all ages, children, and families headed by women. Basic income, because of its unconditional, individual, and additive program design, is as important as the idea because of its unconditional, individual, and additive benefits, has the potential to eliminate absolute poverty even at the modest level of $500 per month, as long as it goes to children as well as adults. As we move from the idea of a basic income to proposals for its implementation, gender egalitarians must insist that a basic income go to children as well as adults. An unconditional individual income provides a modest compensation for unpaid care work without requiring anyone to choose care instead of paid employment, but instead allowing for the combination of both. This begins to reciprocate for the social exploitation of unpaid caregivers by all members of capitalist market economies. Gender egalitarians must insist that any principle of reciprocity recognize all obligations that require reciprocity and not only those incurred in the market sphere. A basic income that goes to children as well as adults provides their carers with the resources to choose to forego paid employment or to purchase formal or informal care arrangements that make work possible. Basic income respects the rights of individuals to make care and other consumption decisions on their own, according to their own understandings of their best interests, rather than having them made for them paternalistically. Gender egalitarians must insist that poor women have the same autonomy over their economic resources and spending decisions as wealthy men and wealthy women have. To achieve these economic goals, gender egalitarians must insist that a basic income be funded by progressive taxation, that it be high enough to eliminate poverty, and that it be structured in ways that free the poor from poverty traps, from the market discipline of immiseration, and from stigma. And while the elimination of poverty on its own would be a tremendous achievement in this country, we must recognize that the basic income has the potential to redistribute power as well as income. Even a modest, independent individual income increases the status and voice of lower earners within families and provides them with the resources required for exit from those families when necessary. Even a modest basic income, when combined with earned income, gives recipients more power as consumers to shape their local economies through the ability to make consumption choices on values other than price alone. Even a modest basic income can increase the adaptability of workers to market disruptions by facilitating mobility, education and training, and small-scale entrepreneurship. And even a modest basic income has the potential to increase the voice and participation in the political sphere of those who are now poor. To achieve these political goals, we don't need complete economic equality. We need, one might say, a guaranteed minimum of economic power, an economic vote, much like the political vote that we've come to take for granted in modern democracies, but which was as revolutionary and radical in its time as basic income may seem now. Adopting the principles of unconditionality, universality, and individuality points the way to other necessary reforms in our capitalist democracy, like the need for universal health care, the need to decouple other social benefits like pensions from paid employment, the need to facilitate greater part-time work and job sharing, and the need to reform employment practices that work against gender pay equity, like basing pay increases on seniority in continuous employment. Taking a gender perspective to basic income also points the way to the incremental steps we can take on the road to a true basic income, like universal child benefits and universal pensions. We can take steps toward gender equality by implementing individual taxation and even a modest tax on wealth, both of which would give us much more information on exactly how much gender inequality currently exists, gender income inequality, which is hidden by the family and household basis of both our tax and benefit systems. Addressing poverty and inequality without a gender perspective obscures the structural inequalities inherent in the gender division of labor and in our prioritization of market norms over family norms, making it possible to believe that disparities in income and wealth are due primarily to disparities in education, skills, talent, and effort. When we look at poverty and inequality through the lens of gender, we have to choose to believe either that men deserve more resources than women because they contribute more to society, or that many of our current social institutions are inequitable and need to change. The principles at the core of a basic income point us to the reforms that we need to make to achieve true gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Almaz. I think we have a bit less than half an hour, so I'm going to ask you 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll open up for questions. So probably before I ask my 4th questions, I'm going to ask you to start lining up, but don't do that right now, because otherwise you will stand for a little while. Okay, so that was very interesting. So I guess my first question is about something that I often hear, which is the idea that if we, that you're entirely right to think that caregivers should get compensation, they should get something. But then why don't we, instead of going for a universal basic income, why don't we just expand the EITC to integrate caregivers? So that's an idea that some people even that are interested in universal basic income as an ideal often push for. They say maybe that's the step forward. Or maybe that's even the way forward, full stop, right? So I'm interested in your response to that. Do you have kind of efficiency-based response to that? Are you worried about kind of take-up rates? Or are you saying that if we are not going all the way universal, we are going to actually miss out on some people who need it, some people who are caregivers, but for some reasons of access are not actually getting those benefits? Or is it a principled answer? Do you think that everyone's deserving of that income, even if they don't contribute in any way? So in brief, when we are trying to design those systems to screen out surfers, is your view really that there is no way to do that and to integrate all the deserving people, or is your view that even surfers should be fed?
Thanks. That's a great question. So yes, I would say absolutely it is my view that even surfers should be fed. And I would base that argument on a slightly different argument than the one that I gave today, which was really focused on the question of gender and really touches more on the vast inequality of wealth that we have in our society and not just inequality of income. So I think that when you think about the reasons that private property is allowed, right? Why is it allowed for us to take resources out of the commons and exclude other people from using those resources? Well, this would be a different talk, but generally the argument is that doing so increases the size of the pie for everybody, right? It makes us more productive if we're able to privatize some things, pursue our own self-interest, and in the process generate the common good through the work that we do with privatization. So that's, I think, a very plausible explanation. I believe in private property. I support it. But if it turns out that we end up, once we implement private property, with a society in the richest society in the world where we have millions of people living in poverty, then there's something wrong with the way that common good is being distributed. So that's kind of the short answer to the surfer question. I think that we should redistribute as kind of a capital dividend some of the wealth that we have in our society unconditionally, and that would go to surfers as well as people who are doing either care work or productive work in the labor market. But to go back to the idea of expanding the earned income tax credit to include caregivers, certainly that would be an improvement for the people who currently can't get it, but it's completely against the structure of the earned income tax credit, which you only get when you have earnings. So you would have to have earnings as a caregiver first before you would get the supplement, because really the EITC is just a supplement for low wages. Really what the EITC is a way of refunding payroll taxes to low-wage workers, right? Because the system of taxation we have in the U.S. Deliberately excludes forgetting exactly what the exclusion is, but let's say roughly $10,000 of earned income from income taxes. But we pay Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes on the very first dollar of our income. So even people who are earning poverty level incomes are paying payroll taxes. So the EITC is really just a way of refunding those payroll taxes to those low-wage workers. So they're not facing taxes right away. It's right to increase the incentives to engage in paid labor. If you want to support caregivers, you have to give them an income, because otherwise there's no supplement.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I guess my second question really follows from this, which is, even if so let's say we agree for a second that universal basic income is part of the ideal of a just society. A question that people, especially activists and people in the basic income movement, often ask themselves is which midway policies are actually a way forward, and how do we know how to identify which policy are a way forward if we can't have a full universal basic income right now? And this is where maybe the expanding of the EITC is not like the best idea of this, but tapping onto existing paradigms and trying to surf the waves of existing framings or existing conceptions, or going radically for a different conception of what we owe each other is always a difficult question. So the idea of taking for granted that people just value work very much and that we should just start from there and just expand our conception of what counts as meaningful work could be seen as a step forward on the one hand, but on the other hand, we might worry that this reinforces the paradigms that actually we are trying to fight in the first place when we are trying to think about something much more ambitious. So I guess my question is, from the perspective of gender equality, what do we think are the steps towards a universal basic income if we can't get a full universal unconditional basic income?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I do think that we, when we move sort of from theory to practice, we do have to have some ideas of what incremental implementation would look like. So I guess if I'm speaking personally, I would rather go for a very, very modest, unconditional, universal, and individual payment. And I think that it's plausible, not maybe under this administration, but it's plausible, I think, to go for something like that in the context of tax reform. If we could get tax simplification and say, rather than the raft of complicated, very targeted tax credits that we have, we say, you know what, we're just going to give everybody a small investment tax credit, let's say, that compensates for the loss of some of these other exclusions from income and tax credits. That's one possible way forward. So I would, my first choice would be very much to hold on to unconditionality, universality, and individuality. So you could think of something like the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend also as a model. And for those who aren't familiar with it, the state of Alaska, because that is a lot of state-owned land which has oil in it or under it, the state of Alaska, in the name of its citizens, gets a tremendous amount of oil revenue every year, which it puts into a fund that is then invested, and there's a dividend paid from that fund. So I don't consider that a basic income because it's not really targeted to needs, and it's very variable depending on the investment returns. But again, you could say, we're a wealthy capitalist country. There is a lot of wealth produced in this country. Maybe everybody should get a dividend, a flat dividend that could be variable depending on the year of some of the wealth that is created in the society. Again, as being part of the participation just as citizens in a society that allows for private property appropriation and frankly unlimited private property appropriation in the United States. So I would rather go with something that is that meets those three core principles. If I had to compromise on anything else, as I said, I think that universal child benefits is where I would go, because the burdens of caring for children really contribute a lot to poverty and lower income for carers, whether they're men or women. disproportionately women. So something that supports the needs of children, I think, would be a good incremental step. Again, it can be very small to establish the principle, or a universal floor for pensions for seniors, which we don't have under the Social Security system.
Great. So my next question is very related. So it's about the other things that we need in order for universal basic income to be truly progressive and to really help us move forward to a more just society. So you've discussed that a little bit at the end of your talk, but I like the idea that Stuart White describes as the egalitarian toolkit, right? The idea that you need a set of policies to get to a just society. There isn't a single policy that will ever get us to that goal. And so in your ideal society, I guess, or in the mid-ideal society, what would be needed for universal basic income to work well? I think you've talked about social norms at some point. So of course, if we are in a context where we still think that caregiving is not a meaningful contribution to society, and where we still have androgenic perceptions of what counts as contribution, of course we won't have gone all the way. So that's one example of something that needs to change in the process as well. But I wonder if you could point out a few other either policies or normative changes that we need in order for a universal basic income to really help us serve the ends of gender equality.
Yeah, so I think that you know, as I hope I implied, whether we have a basic income, whether we get a basic income in the end is, obviously that would be the goal, but even thinking about a basic income, I think bringing a basic income, the principles behind a basic income into our social and political discourse can be very helpful, because I think it makes us question why we have the inequality that we have, why we have poverty when we are so wealthy and could easily eliminate it. So, you know, I think that thinking about the principles and saying, okay, well, we're not going as far as the basic income, but what does the principle of unconditionality suggest? I think that maybe could get us to something like a child benefits, or the principle of universality. I think the principle of individuality can get us to this idea of individual taxation, which in fact has been, where it's been adopted in Europe, has been shown to increase women's labor force participation. So that would be one thing that doesn't, you know, get us to a basic income, but gets us a little bit of the way. I think we have to confront our growing wealth inequality in particular, and we don't like to talk a lot about wealth in the US, but I think, again, thinking about a basic income, debating it, discussing it, thinking about alternatives to it, forces us to think about other ways that we might attack this problem. But we've got to understand that we have a problem before we do. So again, I hope that basic income can stimulate us to think about what we do about wealth inequality. And again, on a practical basis, even, and this is Thomas Piketty's suggestion, you know, so Thomas Piketty in Capital in the 21st Century, which was a survey of growing wealth and income inequality around the world, but focused on Western Europe and the United States, made a proposal for a global tax on wealth. Again, people dismiss that as implausible, just like a basic income. But you know, what he said, and I think this is an important point, is even a tiny tax on capital, 1%, 1/10 of 1%, 1/100th of 1%, forces us to actually confront the wealth inequality that we have, because that means that everybody has to account for their wealth. And then you actually see things like the fact that 50% of Americans have 1% of the wealth in our society, which comes out to something like $11,000 in assets for the bottom 50% of Americans, the bottom 50%. We think of ourselves as a middle-class country. We're not a middle-class country. We're a poor country with a very small group of middle-class and a tiny group of very, very wealthy people. So asking people to document, okay, so what are your assets? And when we think about documenting your assets, we tend to think in the United States about housing. And in fact, we say, well, we never tax wealth. That's un-American. We don't tax wealth. Well, of course we tax wealth. We tax property. That is the bulk of the wealth that most Americans who have even a little bit of wealth have. But when we tax property, for example, we tax the value of the entire house, even though for most Americans, they don't own the house. The bank owns the house. right? So somehow we've tricked Americans to paying taxes on the wealth of banks in the form of our mortgages on our houses. So even a tiny, tiny wealth tax that forces an accounting of wealth disparities in the US could be very helpful.
Thank you so much, Almaz. Before I ask my last question, can I ask those who have questions to start lining up? I was going to say in front of the mics, but I can't see microphones. Okay, so you don't need to stand then. Okay, I'll just point towards you if you have a question later. Okay, so my last question is really just about, it's a really big question. It's about what we mean in general by gender justice and gender equality. And in particular, when we talk about universal basic income, we can have very different women in mind, right? And the concerns that we may have will be or might be very different depending on the women that we are talking about. So my question would be, how do we think about gender justice and gender empowerment in light of extreme diversity in the situation of women in the US and everywhere? And here are just a few examples. So sex workers. So I'm thinking about the Sex Workers Open University, for example, that has endorsed basic income as part of their manifesto and have very particular reasons for insisting and pushing for basic income. Then another group I think about is the National Alliance of Domestic Workers, who are domestic workers who are often extremely invisible and are subjected to all form of abuse. And here we are talking about domestic workers working for others, cleaners and people looking after other people's children and other people's aging parents. And of course we could go on and talk about various women and how they could stand to benefit from universal basic income. How do you think about that diversity, and which women do you have in mind most when you think about gender equality and basic income?
Well, one of the things that I think is a huge advantage of a basic income is that money is very, very fungible, right? So a basic income doesn't tell women or anyone else how to live their lives. As I said, you can use it as a replacement for an income so that you can devote yourself to care work, or you can use it to purchase care work from other people, whether formally in a daycare center or informally by paying your mother or another relative, your father, whoever, to take care of your kids. So unlike the, what political theorist Nancy Fraser calls the universal breadwinner model, which, is more or less based on sort of the Scandinavian norm, where there's a lot of social provision of care for children and elders, and the expectation that everybody works, men and women work. That's really pushing all people to adopt what are typically male lives, right? Everybody goes to work and care is commodified, really in a way devalues care. It says that nobody should be devoting themselves full-time to care unless they're being paid for it. And what that tends to do is empower more affluent women who can have families and full-time or even more than full-time jobs, and have care is essentially sort of pushed down the economic ladder, right? So if I'm affluent and I pay a good wage to my nanny, then my nanny maybe can put her children into state-sponsored childcare, but the women who work in state-sponsored childcare who are getting minimum wage, they can't pay anyone to care for their children. So their children are being cared for by their family members or by older children who are not being paid. So there's in a lot of the sort of traditional ideas of empowering women, what you're actually doing is empowering a certain class of women and not empowering other women. So I think that's one important feature of a basic income. When it comes to people who are engaged in work that is marginalized in society, I think we should be realistic. I think there's no magic in a basic income that would suddenly make it much easier to be a domestic worker or less dangerous to be a sex worker. I think we should be realistic about that. But I think that any amount of economic empowerment should help those who are currently at the margins of society to have the power to be a little bit more politically active and to fight for whatever laws or regulations would make their jobs easier.
Thank you so much, Almaz. Questions from the audience? And if you raise your hand, I'm going to point towards you, and then someone will bring you. Okay, great.
Hi. Thank you so much. So my question is about the fact that there are many different dimensions of gender injustice. One is the lack of representation in women in various spheres, the workforce, things like that. Another might be a lack of power in both the family, lack of exit options, and in larger communities. But a third dimension of gender injustice that is very important to me is the devaluation, the low valuation of traditionally feminine characteristics, traits, and activities. And I am pretty worried that a basic income does not touch that third dimension. And maybe, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have to do all things. It is not all of justice. But I wonder if you could say more about that, because I've had this alternative in my mind of caregiving as sort of a national service that, you know, so if you have an infant or a dying parent, it's like being in the Marines. But if somewhere in between, sometimes it's like being in the National Guard, where you do other jobs and this national service. But treating it like a national service could get at that third dimension of the valuation in a way that a basic income seems to me doesn't. And I wonder if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point and an interesting way that you've phrased it. I mean, in my understanding of basic income, I think it does value care, and I think that it's one way in which gender justice is sometimes conceived of, particularly by feminists, and in that debate that Juliana mentioned about whether feminists should endorse a basic income. One of the proposals was that something like, we'll know what we've achieved gender justice if men and women have perfectly symmetrical lives. Right, so that would mean men and women are engaging in equal amounts of care and equal amounts of paid employment, et cetera, you know, among a number of different dimensions. And I have to say, I find that really unconvincing and not an attractive model, because I think, frankly, I hope I can say this in this audience, I think a lot of things that men do are pretty stupid. And I think it's actually liberating for women. This is one of the liberating aspects of being, I think, often the secondary earner in a family, which is that it's possible to say, you know what, I don't want to work for an advertising agency. That doesn't bring me any joy. I don't feel like I'm contributing to society in any way. I would rather take a lower paying job in the public sector or in some kind of service field, because I just think that that's worth more of my time than making more money for somebody for something that I don't believe in. And I think that actually, you know, we should recognize the fact that men are trapped by these gender roles and these expectations as much as women are. So, you know, I think that when often in heterosexual couples, when a child is added to the family, well, we know actually the data shows that when men have children and they're in the workforce, their incomes go up. When women have children and they're in the workforce, their incomes go down. And why is that? I mean, I think there's a social recognition. Well, it's a family man now, right? We've got to pay him more so that he can support his family. But probably also the men are thinking, well, I've got to work harder now because I've got the primary responsibility for paying for this. And women have the kind of the opposite expectation, right? I'm expected to be the carer, and I'm not making as much money anyway, so I should be the one to withdraw from the workforce. So both men and women are trapped in these roles. But I think that it's important to create social institutions and social supports that allow each of us individually to choose the life that we find most meaningful. And if for some people, if it's going to be making a lot of money, that's great. For other people, if it's going to be caring, that's great as well. For most of us, I think it'll be a combination of both. And I think that I would rather, that's the slight libertarian in me that comes out, that says that I would rather not impose service of different kinds on different populations that aren't interested in them. But I will say that I think that that's another way of, that's another vision of justice. And I think that the problem that basic income has without the gender perspective is that it's easily falls prey, that's maybe putting it a little bit negatively, but it's open to the objection that everybody should do something. We should have some form of national service. We should have some participation requirement, with participation broadly defined to include care or volunteer work. It should be monitored, it should be documented, and we should all do it. I think that that's without tremendous amounts of wealth inequality, I think that's a plausible vision of justice. It's not one I find very attractive. And I think once you've got a tremendous amount of inequality, then I think it's also not a plausible system of justice.
You have a question here in the back.
I think you need a microphone.
It's coming.
No, but because it's being filmed.
And then there will be another question on this side. So if we have a second mic to get ready. Yeah, maybe I could give my. I think there was another one though.
So the UBI is beautiful in that it's elegant and it captures, all these things we want to account for. But from an economic standpoint, I worry that it's not precise enough in rewarding people for pro-social activity that's not rewarded by the marketplace, right? Like caregiving. Something like a carbon tax is more precise in that it's like modulated by, how much I consume or whatever. How do you address a concern like that?
So I think that the way I would address it is by saying that there are some ways in which we privately or individually reciprocate for various things, and there are some ways that we socially reciprocate, or we set up social institutions, right? So think about Social Security. Why don't we just let people save for retirement? You save for retirement, you have that discipline of saving, then you've got a comfortable retirement. You spend all your money, you don't. Well, we've decided in our society that, in fact, we don't want people to have that individual responsibility. We don't want them to make that individual choice. We want to make sure that everybody is taken care of in retirement, although we don't do a great job of that in the United States. But in principle, we do. So we've socialized, in a sense, part of the retirement savings. Not all of it. Social Security isn't great for everybody who's on it. But we've said partly this is a social responsibility to make sure that everybody has enough in retirement. So I think that's what I would say is that, yes, obviously, what we don't want is to create a society in which children no longer feel responsibility to reciprocate for the care from their parents because there's a basic income that does that, right? We want both. We want both the individual, personal, specific kind of reciprocity, but we want a more general social reciprocity as well.
Hello. There's quite a few perspectives one could have on basic income. Given my background, I did my postgraduate in international finance in Europe and my graduate in income tax accounting, and putting any theoretical and moral discussions aside, knowing what I know about living like in the Bay Area or California, seems to me that the minimum would need to be much higher than what I've heard. And so I'm talking like
I don't disagree.
tens of thousands of dollars. Housing, food, clothing, medical insurance, medical care, however you want to look at that. So do you think that's a valid perspective to have?
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially being in the Bay Area, it's expensive here, and basic income of the amount that I'm suggesting is not going to go very far. But the question is, where do we start? Do we start by identifying the maximum amount and I think really scaring people off? Or do we start with identifying a minimum amount, but a minimum amount that would make a significant difference? So the reason for choosing the amount that I did is purely because that's how we define absolute poverty as a society. Those poverty thresholds are 30 years old. I mean, they get adjusted for inflation, but they don't get adjusted to reflect the changes in our spending patterns from the 1960s when they were first defined. So they're woefully inadequate. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm defending them or defending that as an adequate minimum. But I do think that it's important when we talk about basic income to get some specific numbers out there, because if we don't, then, you know, I have to say, I think frankly a lot of the basic income conversation that comes out of Silicon Valley is a little utopian. I don't really hear who's paying for it. I don't really hear how it's going to change power dynamics at all. I hear it as a kind of an easy way to take care of the fact that some jobs are going to be automated and are going to go away. I think we're facing a much bigger problem. We're facing a much bigger problem now. We don't have to wait for automation. We already have a significant amount of automation and globalization. So, you know, we need to address that now. But I really think it's important for people to kind of put the money on the table and say, how much are we actually talking about when we're talking about a basic income? And also to say, which I didn't do in this talk, to say, you know, where's that money coming from? I didn't do so much. I did talk a little bit about wealth taxation, but there are going to be some losers here, and we should be upfront about that. But I think that, and I have this conversation all the time, so I don't mean to be you know, picking on you in any sense, but I think you already have to have a certain degree of affluence to think that $6,000 a year on an additive basis, on an individual basis, isn't going to make a difference. For millions of people in the United States, it's going to make a huge difference.
On this note, I think we have to leave the room for these poor students that have to take a math exam. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much, Almaz. And I think, Johnny, do you still want people to leave through the side doors? Yeah. So please, if you can go out through the side doors. Thank you.